All right, everyone. Today we're going to dive into the fascinating history of psychology, the evolution of clinical psychology, really. When most people think of psychology, I think they probably imagine therapy, or maybe Freud, or maybe those brain images that you see in the media. And even though we continually talk and think of psychology as a young science, no, it really has its roots that stretch back thousands of years. So if you think about that time, thousands of years ago, can you imagine what it would be like to live in those times when mental illness was seen as a curse, when it was seen as a moral failing, or even possession by an evil spirit? Can you picture in your mind those individuals who endured all that unimaginable suffering, um, only to really face treatments that were probably worse than the conditions they were meant to cure? Take trepanation, for example, where a hole was drilled into the skull with a crude stone instrument. There was no anesthesia, no sterilization, and what was the purpose? To release evil spirits. Or take the rack. This was a device that was used to stretch the body in agonizing ways. And why were they doing that? To purge the afflicted of their sins. In medieval times, exorcisms and tortures and even isolation were all very common practices too. And I think all of these things really were, for the most part, used in the name of healing. But all of these ancient civilizations, they didn't think about the mind as we do today. Instead, in those times, mental health issues were often seen as supernatural or a spiritual phenomenon. Ancient Egyptians believed that the mentally ill had evil spirits inside of them and that need to be purged. And they thought the mind was connected to the heart. If something was wrong with the heart, they believed that the mind would suffer as well. In ancient Greece, philosophers, well, primarily Hippocrates, proposed that mental illness resulted from an imbalance in the body's four humors. You probably read about these in other classes: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and what's the gross one? Oh, phlegm. Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, also Greek philosophers, they are the ones that did begin to look at the concept of the mind in ways that sort of more resonate with modern psychology. For example, Plato believed that the soul was the key to understanding human behavior. Aristotle, who was Plato's student, he took more of an empirical approach. He studied the mind through observation. And what did this lead to? This laid the groundwork for what would later become the scientific method, because the scientific method is based on what? Observation. Later, in the Middle Ages, the focus of the mind shifted again, and it was largely influenced now by religion. Mental illness was often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment, and it led to people getting practices or treatment like exorcisms or witch hunts. But by the Renaissance age, people were getting really freaked out. They were so freaked out by this weird behavior that society began to separate those with mental illness from the general population. And what this did was led to the creation of asylums. Now, asylums were really intended to be places of refuge. But what they really ended up devolving into was prisons, where neglect and abuse was rampant. One infamous example is Bethlem Royal Hospital in London. It was better known as Bedlam, if you want to look that up and read about its fascinating story. In general, patients there were chained to walls. They were left in filthy conditions. They were treated as entertainment for visitors who would come to pay to look at them. So now the focus really wasn't on healing, it was more on control. But thankful, later in the same era, the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries, some found a renewed interest in the human mind. One of those was Rene Descartes. And what he proposed that was so profound was a mind-body dualism. This was the idea that the mind and the body were separate entities. And why was this so profound? Well, this theory set the stage for psychology to emerge as a scientific discipline. In the 16 and 1700s, medical professionals began to explore physical explanations for mental illness. Their treatments were still pretty primitive. They used things like bloodletting with leeches, or purging, or things called spinning chairs. These were all common methods. But you know what? They often left the patients weaker and sicker. But then changes began to take root again. So in the late 18th and early 19th century, we finally meet the visionaries who dared to challenge the status quo. So an example of that would be Philippe Pinel in France. He removed the chains from patients in the Bicêtre hospital. He advocated for kindness and respect. He believed that patients should be treated with compassion. That mental illness was a disease of the mind, that we could understand mental illness, that it could be treated. His approach, though, was pretty unorthodox. It was called the moral treatment. But you know what it did? It did prioritize human dignity and meaningful interactions. And around that same time in England, so we're jumping from France to England, William Tuke founded the York Retreat. And this was an institution where patients were also treated with compassion and respect, just like Pinel's facility. Tuke's direction was to use things like relaxation and a stable routine, and just like Pinel, some kind of moral guidance. So Pinel and Tuke's ideas are important because they were principles that would help shape modern mental health care system that we have today and our modern therapeutic practices that we use today. So if we jump from Europe to the United States, there were some things going on there too that kind of were leading to a better mental health revolution. Dorothea Dix, for example, emerged as a really a tireless advocate for the mentally ill. There were some pretty horrifying conditions in mental hospitals here, and she was exposed to that. And because she was so upset about it, she went to the state legislatures and she lobbied to build more humane institutions. And you know what? She was pretty successful. Her work revolutionized the way mental illness was viewed and treated because it emphasized compassion and medical care over punishment. Now, if we jump even later into the late 19th century, so around, I'm going to say maybe 1878, 1879 kind of period, Wilhelm Wundt opened the first experimental psychology laboratory, but this was at the University of Leipzig in Germany. So we're jumping back over the pond from the United States to Europe. Wilhelm Wundt is often called the father of modern psychology. You probably learned that in B110 or an introduction to psychology class, I'm sure. What he did was he argued that the mind could be studied scientifically, and he did that through something called introspection. Now, what his work did was help psychology break away from its philosophical roots and become a distinct scientific field, and that was awesome. If you jump back over, though, about the same time to the United States, there was another individual who was doing about the same thing, William James. He was making waves with his practical approach to psychology, too. He founded something called functionalism. And this is where you examine how mental processes, when I say mental processes, I mean things like memory or perception, how those help people adapt to their environments. His work, James's work, was instrumental in shifting the focus from studying the mind's components to understanding its purpose. And then, of course, we have good old Sigmund Freud, whose exploration of the unconscious mind forever changed psychology. Freud's psychoanalysis delved into things like dreams and repressed desires and childhood experiences, basically the unconscious. So he offered new ways to understand human behavior. And though they were pretty controversial at the time, they still are in many ways, his work did lay the foundation for modern psychotherapy. Now, the 20th century is where psychology branched into new areas. Behaviorism, led by John Watson and our own Indiana University B.F. Skinner, focused on observation of behavior and environmental influences. Their studies of conditioning, I hope you remember what conditioning is, revolutionized education. It revolutionized therapy. It really did change our understanding of human behavior. But in addition to that, the humanistic psychology front started. It was championed by, you'll recognize these names, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. They emphasized the positive aspects of human experience. They emphasize things like self-actualization. And that compassionate, client-centered therapy is what we have today. That we have today is thanks to them. Now, I think today, psychology is incredibly diverse. Cognitive psychology studies how we think and how we remember and how we solve problems. Neuropsychology explores the brain's influence on behavior. Social psychology examines how our thoughts and actions are shaped by others. And the therapeutic techniques we use today, like cognitive behavioral therapy, they have helped countless people heal and grow. Today, clinical psychology is more advanced than it ever was thanks to technology. Therapists can use brain science. They can use online therapy platforms. They can use artificial intelligence even to diagnose and to treat mental health issues. How fascinating is that? We're just constantly evolving, finding new ways to help people. And I think we're finally beginning to break down the barriers of mental health stigma. But here's what I want you to understand most today. It's that the history of psychology is not just a history of ideas. It's really a history of humanity's quest to understand itself. Think about that journey from trepanation to cognitive behavioral therapy. It really reflects our evolving capacity for compassion and understanding, doesn't it? The pioneers of psychology that we just talked about, from Dorothea Dix to Wilhelm Wundt, those were visionaries. They saw the potential to transform lives. They didn't just study the mind, they fought to improve the world. So you see, all of those from the past who have influenced psychology and influenced mental health care, what they did was they challenged the status quo because they saw the potential for change. They didn't just study the mind, they applied their knowledge to improve lives, to make the world a better place. So to me, it feels like the legacy of psychology, if you asked my opinion, if you look at history, is built on action. It's built on understanding human suffering and finding ways to heal it. And today, you know, We live in a world where violence and division and the care for one another, or the lack of care, I should say, are all too common. We see people struggling with their mental health. Too many remain unheard, they remain misunderstood or ignored. And you know what the common denominator of many of these societal problems are? It's mental health. So the need for compassion and empathy and understanding, it's more urgent now than ever. We need to find ways to heal that human suffering. So to wrap up my little spiel here today, what I'm trying to say is that the world needs more than just knowledge. It needs action. It needs visionaries who will use psychology to create a more just and caring society and to heal human suffering. So here's what I'm challenging you with today. Is there anything that you can do to contribute to that? Now, I think the story of psychology is far from over. Let me revise that. I know the story of psychology is far from over. I think the next chapter, though, is your generation's one to write. Cheers.